Your own podcast, moving up in the world. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's unsupervised learning.
Hey everybody, this is Razib, and I am here with Dr. Charles Murray, who I think probably doesn't need much of an introduction. But Chuck, can you just tell the listener like how you would introduce yourself if you had your druthers?
I guess I've never been asked that before. I think of myself as a social scientist who's a data nerd.
Yeah.
That's the thing I really enjoy. I love playing with large databases, and I love doing all that stuff myself. And I know I've got a reputation for a variety of other things, but that's what I love to do.
Yeah. Okay, well, I was gonna ask some different stuff first, but then I have to ask you, like, what is it like for you to see the proliferation of things like R and online cloud databases with freely accessible data? I mean, how has that been for you over the last couple of decades? Really, over the last 10 years is probably really when it's accelerated.
Yeah, in terms of things like R, I just have never learned it. I don't do any programming. I've used Stata, have been using Stata, I guess, well, let's see now. I think I used it during Human Accomplishment, right after Human Accomplishments. We're talking 15, 18 years with Stata. Before that, it was JMP, and I don't do any of my own programming. In terms of the other changes that have gone on, some of them have been wonderful. So that having IPUMs with all of the census data online, Social Explorer, a wide being able to download, which we've been able to do for a long time now, these big national surveys. The access to data has been changed revolutionarily in the last 20 years, and for me, it's just been like a cornucopia of riches.
Yeah, I do have to say, just the lack of time in my day is a huge constraint on what I can do because a lot of these statistical skills are pretty general across domains. And these resources that you've talked about, like I've actually downloaded, large subsets of them, and a lot of them I just haven't had time to get into, partly because of just constraints on job, family, etc. And I do have to say, I'm a little younger than you, but when I first noticed that these were coming online in the 2000s for people, I thought more people would make recourse to them. A lot of people with software engineering, programming skills. And I feel like 2020 is not where we are in terms of people actually engaging the data as opposed to doing the same old opining on impressions that they were doing 20 years ago. I mean, what's your sense of that?
I didn't quite understand what you said that they're doing. That's the same old from 20 years ago.
I mean, it's not as bad as trend pieces, but people aren't doing, like, for example, I'll give you a concrete example. I wrote a piece for op-ed for the New York Times. I think it was published in early 2016 about support for abortion rights. And there's this idea that, well, women support abortion rights and men don't. That's just not borne out by the data. There's like really robust data. It's just not borne out by the data. And in the past, the data was probably in books, or it might have been in Gallup, and you'd have to read particular things. But now you could just go to the general social survey. Like, you can confirm this within a minute. I still see quote unquote pundits talk about how abortion rights is an issue because, for Republicans, for example, because women support abortion right. Again, that's just not borne out by the data. And this is not a situation where you can not read the particular publication. You can actually check within 30 seconds.
Yeah,
And people continue to do this.
Yeah, I will generalize from your example with the abortion issue to a whole bunch of other things where you can check within minutes, and there are lots of things besides the GSS you can go to, all sorts of stuff that is asserted. And that has never been more apparent than during this last summer. I mean, the things that are said about, cops targeting blacks and so forth. First place, there's a good literature on this that's been done. But the second thing is there are numbers. There are numbers out there in terms of, for example, and by the way, Razib, this is one of the things that's still way underused, I think, by applied social scientists. The open data movement means that you have all sorts of cities, major cities, which have databases of every officer engaged shooting, and with all sorts of stuff about it that can be downloaded, and you don't have to rely on somebody else having analyzed these trends. You got the data in front of you and look at it. And throughout all of the Sturm und Drang during the summer of 2020, you saw very few pieces that were taking kind of a dispassionate look at, well, what do we know about this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, if I could editorialize, I would say that 20 years ago, I would laugh at postmodernists and postmodernism, partly because, we will have the tools, I thought at the time, we will have the tools to analyze the world in a very data-intensive, theory-rich way in the near future because of computation. And yet it seems that what we're seeing is actually more manipulation of the public and their perceptions in a very conscious way by, the powers that are distributing and controlling information, which is, that's pretty dispiriting. So I want to move just really quickly because I know the listeners will want me to touch on your public work with your books and all these, these sorts of things. You're in the public eye a lot. And so I want to talk about that real quick. Your latest book was Human Diversity, the Biology of Gender, Race, and Class. I have a question where I think when Coming Apart came out, and also Human Accomplishment, you were covered pretty, like you were on NPR. I remember listening to you on NPR and stuff like that. What is the reception to human diversity been in terms of getting media access? Because my impression, this is a different time in my life. Maybe I don't listen to his NPR as much, et cetera. But I haven't heard much about this book compared to the previous.
It's
books.
Fascinating. I mean, from a detached point of view, it's just fascinating, Razib. You're right about these other books. That I've always been reviewed with every major book I've done by the New York Times, Sunday Book Review, by the Wall Street Journal, usually in the essay section on weekends, by the Washington Post Sunday book section, every single time. And I've been on lots of radio and TV. So we had Human Diversity come out in, I think, the third week of January of this year. So they're about 6 weeks before COVID hit. After COVID hits, you can say, well, who knows why things are happening. But that's 6 weeks in which the New York Times had a review in the Daily New York Times by a fine arts master's degree, which is not really the technical background you're looking for to review my book, but not the Sunday New York Times, no review in the Wall Street Journal, no review in the Post, etc. No NPR stuff, no, not even any Fox stuff. I guess there was one quick segment. In other words, I'm saying it's almost as if people were ignoring me because this book has all sorts of stuff in it that ordinarily should, get people quite upset, but not a peep. I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist about it. Maybe I'm just yesterday's news, but it's pretty interesting.
Well, I mean, I would say that just observing the way people react to you, I do feel that starting around 2010, I don't know if it's a conspiracy, but I felt like there was a conscious attempt to marginalize and dismiss you as, in very negative terms. Obviously, I don't want to get into that. But I felt like there was an inflection point around like the early teens where they were like, let's not even engage. And it kind of prefigured a general trend in our culture, which, we don't necessarily need to get into because everyone else has talked about it. But I do think that something changed there. in terms of the engagement of your book, like what have the what is the public said? Like, I'm sure you get emails, like, is there any interesting reaction there?
Well, it's a funny thing because actually I've gotten some good reactions from people that I'm very pleased about getting good reactions from. There's been a blog by a quite credible, respected academic geneticist saying, this is a pretty good account of what's been going on in genetics. There is a guy at the University of Chicago that's been doing a review that I actually expected to be coming out in the Claremont Review of Books, but I have seen the review and it's a very positive review. The so the only responses I've gotten so far are few, uh, but pretty good in terms of them saying, "Well, this is a book that you have to take seriously." However, it's a very small amount. I think you're right about the inflection point, by the way, because Coming Apart came out in 2012, and I thought I was fully rehabilitated. Coming Apart was very well received by a wide segment of the ideological spectrum, and got a lot of attention. And I thought I was out of the woods. I thought I'd finally outlived the infamy of the bell curve. But as wokeness spread on the campuses, all that changed. And of course, it by 2016, when Trump was made his appearance, I think at that point, anybody who's identified as being on the right sort of became a surrogate for being able to attack Trump, even if the person on the right openly said he despised Trump. So there was an inflection point, and it has not gone away. But on the other hand, I'm old enough, I don't really care that much anymore. Getting on NPR is not the peak of my ambition.
Yeah, and and the whole media landscape has changed over that time as well. The distribution of information has become democratized, which has positives and negatives. So I want to ask about Coming Apart because I feel like, I mean, The Bell Curve's the book that you're going to be quote unquote known for, but in some ways, Coming Apart is, I don't know, I think more relevant to this age. Like, Black Lives Matter, the racial conflicts aside, I think Coming Apart was just, it highlighted an important issue in terms of the divisions within, what you would call white America, right? So can you just restate your thesis and talk about how you feel about it now in 2020?
Yeah, it's actually something that very few reviewers, if any, noticed about Coming Apart is it's essentially an extension of the bell curve. The bell curve, Dick and I were writing that in the early 1990s. It was published in 1994. And in the last couple of chapters, we said, if we keep going in this direction, we're going to be developing this cognitive elite that's increasingly isolated, that has very different priorities than the rest of the country. And there will be a problem of polarization and this and that and the other thing. And Coming Apart essentially said that the things that we predicted in the bell curve are here. We are living in a world in which there is now a cognitive elite, something that I call the new upper class in Coming Apart, that has its own culture, that lives in pretty much cultural isolation from the middle class and the working class, and has aroused the antagonism of the middle class and working class. All of this stuff, which was the centerpiece of Coming Apart, took on an entirely new life when Donald Trump came along. Because Donald Trump, I'm not saying I predicted Donald Trump, but he was a very obvious response to the kind of animosity and polarization that I had been describing.
Yeah, and I do think it's interesting that a lot of the discourse today, a lot of the discussion, public discussion, focuses on, white supremacy and white people versus, people of color, BIPOC, whatever the new term is, and yet a lot of the most extreme polarization is within white people, which this has actually been validated now by social science, where white Democrats, white liberals are much more racially progressive than non-white Democrats. And so for the listener, I'm gonna like recount something that I found very amusing. So there is some evidence in the polling literature that non-whites over Trump's 4-year term have actually like shifted a bit towards him. Not a lot, but they've shifted noticeably towards him, especially young Latino males. And a white academic responded on Twitter, "I don't really understand this, how they could react like this after 4 years of white supremacy." and I just thought it was funny because it's like, how do you know this better than them, right? But I mean, there was no self-consciousness here.
Yeah, I find the whole white supremacy thing in an age of the deaths of despair, where the only group in the country where life expectancy has been going down is working class whites. The idea that white supremacy is the right term for it, as opposed to cognitive elite supremacy, really I find kind of silly. There is an elite in this country that is very privileged, that has enormous amount of power, and race doesn't have a whole lot to do with it. It has all to do with some really smart people who sometimes I think are too smart for their own good.
Well, I mean, speaking of white supremacy, one thing that I do have to say is, I find it silly partly because as a non-white person who's lived in the United States since the 1980s, I have seen many changes, and all those changes point to less white supremacy, less racism, as they would say, my lived experience. So, I've always found it rather silly. A lot of these, I've told some of my academic friends, a lot of the white people who are worried about the resurgence of white supremacy, they would never know because they don't know any non-white people.
I know.
And so it's very abstract unless they themselves are doing it, right? So, but you are a man of a certain age who's experienced many things and lived through many decades. I want to talk about, you growing up and like how your early years shaped you and whatnot. So you remember the 1950s, racism, all this stuff that was happening then, correct? I mean, do you have any memories? Like, could you talk about where you grew up and just like situate the listener?
I grew up in Newton, Iowa, lived in the same house from the time I was brought home from the hospital until I left for Harvard in the fall of 1961. That was the home of the Maytag Company, and which a lot of people have never heard of. It was about halfway down the Fortune 500 list in the 1950s, made washing machines, and it was a company town. But the thing is, and you talk about influences, it was a really good company. So that we had a beautiful public park that was the Maytag Park. We had scholarships for any graduate of Newton High School who was, capable of going to college and didn't have enough money. Fred Maytag II, who was running the place when he built a new plant on the outskirts of town, voluntarily put in, long before the EPA existed, smoke scrubbers because he didn't think it was good for his civic responsibilities to let the smoke billow out over the town. So this was really a great company, and they made a very high quality product. And my wife, who grew up 2 blocks away from me, says it skewed my whole view of American capitalism, because I sort of sometimes think, oh, everybody's like the Maytag Company, and probably they aren't. I grew up, well, the great advantage of growing up in a town of 15,000 is that you have one high school. We had four grade schools, and they were in different parts of town. So even in a town that size, Southwest Newton was where the Maytag executives lived, and that was the rich part of town. It doesn't look rich by the standards of today, but it was. But so in grade school, I was still with that group, but you get into junior high school and high school, they're just one of them, and you are intermixing with the entire range of socioeconomic status, and that's really good for you. You asked me to reminisce about how things have shaped me, and I'll tell you one thing that had a really important effect on me. I was a brainiac, the term that wasn't invented then. We're talking the 1950s, but I was one of the smart kids. And I was in 8th grade, and in 8th grade, you were required, if you were a male, to take shop. And if you were a female, you were required to take home economics. And so there I am in the shop class, And we're making these stools and things. And try as I might, I discovered I wasn't very good at making the stool, whereas a lot of these kids that I could run rings around in English class were better at it than I was. So one thing, I got to know them better because I was in shop class with them. And the second thing was, it was my first encounter with a very important truth that all the smart kids ought to learn. And that is, you know what? There are some things you can't do that well, and other people can do better than you. And that ought to be at the top of your mind. I could go on. I'm not going to keep on rambling on, but Newton, Iowa, I had two big influences on my development. And one was Newton, Iowa, and the other one was Thailand. Because after college, I went to Thailand and ended up staying there for a total of 6 years. I basically spent the last half of the 60s and the early 70s in Thailand. And both of those two things, in many ways, I can trace back all the things I've done since to those roots.
Well, so just out of curiosity, would you say your background in Newton was upper middle class?
Yeah, my dad was a sort of mid-level executive in the Maytag company. He only had a high school diploma, by the way. And he would say, even in the 1950s, he would joke about how he couldn't get a job at Maytag if he applied then, because, of course, by that time, you wouldn't get a job that led to a middle-level management position unless you had a college degree. And by the way, you talk about an influence on me. If you read Real Education and other things where I'm saying too many people are going to college, you will see a great emphasis on the respect that needs to be paid to people who don't have fancy degrees. And part of that is the knowledge that my dad felt, I think, conscious for the end of his life, that he never went to college. And I wanted to tell him, Dad, it doesn't make any difference.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I want to get into education later. I have young children, and I don't know. It's been on my mind. It's been on, my wife and I have been talking about it a lot. So I want to get to that later. But so you were in Thailand, kind of in some ways the most important cultural period in the United States in the second half of the 20th century. Can I say it that way? The late 60s, early 70s?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And do you think that shaped you in some deep way?
Well, the fact that I missed it probably has some imponderable effects. I left continental United States in June of 1965, flying to Hawaii to go to Peace Corps training. I did not set foot in the United States again until December 1968, and that was just for 2 weeks. I was back in Thailand again into the August of 1970. So all of that time, when domestically you had all of the intense, the riots, the bombings, the protests, the rest of it, I wasn't there. I didn't see Walter Cronkite every night on the evening news. I was over in rural Thailand. So it was a very strange kind of thing, Razib. On the one hand, I was very disconnected from what was going on in the US. On the other hand, when I sat in this little house where I was staying up on the Mekong River in this project I was working on, I could see the flashes of the bombs over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So in another sense, I was quite close to it. I've often wondered to myself, what if I'd been in the States during that period? What would it be different? I know how Thailand did change me. I don't know how being in the States would have changed me.
Yeah, that's true. You can't go back and do a randomized trial. I mean, that's the issue with social science. You have to use natural experiments and whatnot. Unless you're North Korean, I guess you could do some things there. So let me ask you about Thailand. What was it? So this is Thailand in 1965. So today Thailand is one of the Asian tigers. It's not developed, but it's not a very underdeveloped country.
No,
like I actually have I have two friends. One's Dutch, one's American, who have both relocated to Thailand. One of them married a Thai woman, and he works at a university there. So, and I have another friend who is an academic at a Malaysian university. So basically, like, you know, there are people who move to Southeast Asia today from the West, and you know, it's not like they're living in the third world anymore. Like, you can have a good, comfortable life. But in the '60s, I'm assuming it was a little different.
Yeah, it was way different. So, I mean, for example, anybody who's listening who's been to Thailand knows that Bangkok is a huge high-rise city, you know, sort of, it's just a big modern urban high-rise city. When I got to Bangkok in 1965, the tallest building in town was 3 stories. The the uh, the first posting I had in Peace Corps, I was up in a beautiful province called Lampang, which is about 60 miles from Chiang Mai, a major tourist center now. I was the only male Farang, the only male foreigner in the province, in the entire province. And of course, now you go there, they're all over the place. So when I was in Thailand in '65, it was a totally different place. And it was at that time in the rural areas, a classic peasant, rice-based culture that was completely outside my experience that I'd ever had before. And being exposed to that experience was just so valuable, because you go to a place like that and you spend your first 3 or 4 months in deep culture shock. I remember I envied a fellow Peace Corps volunteer who got in a car accident and was in traction and broke, you know, both legs and some ribs. I envied him because he had an honorable excuse to go home. I was so desperate to go home. And after about 3 or 4 months, all at once, a switch flips and you love the place. And you stay there for a few years and you walk down the street and you know all the social cues, you understand the language, you know what's going on, you are intimately familiar and comfortable in that culture. And having made that transition from being totally scared and ignorant to being at home is a wonderful maturing experience.
Well, so I mean, can you say in an explicit way like what things changed? Because, you know, obviously in a general way you can one day realize, oh, uh, you know, this is just normal to me. But I mean, like, what are the specific things that are so different between Newton, Iowa and rural Thailand?
Well, uh, the first thing, if you've never done it before, is you don't realize how utterly exhausting it is. Because when you walk down the street in Newton, Iowa, or you walk down the street in Chicago, even if you come from a town, you may feel a little out of place in Chicago, but you still basically understand what's going on around you. When you are in a strange culture and don't yet speak the language, but also are just new to it, as you walk down a street, you're expending enormous nervous energy just because you don't know what's going on and you're trying to figure out what's going on. It's language, it's local cultural patterns. For example, in Thailand, you will often see people, you know, smiling and even laughing at the scene of an accident. And that's sort of a Thai way of coping with stress, but it's completely unfamiliar to someone from America. And in all sorts of other ways in which people communicate, you're learning a foreign language as well as the language itself. So that's one set of things. The other set of things that happened to me in Thailand were very specific to my subsequent work. The formative experience professionally, well, first place, I got interested in analyzing data over there. I was doing, after I got a Peace Corps, I was doing research on contract to the USAID program, going up to countries in upcountry Thailand, villages in upcountry Thailand, and, you know, trying to win the hearts and minds of the villagers or figure out how to do so. And in the course of this, I became quite confident that I understood Thai villages way better than a lot of the anthropologists who wrote about them. And I just said to myself, these guys are wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. But I had this very strong sense at that point, I can't prove they're wrong. All I can do is I can write this narrative, like their narrative, but saying different things. And I want something that I can put on the table and say, this is hard and fast evidence that I'm right and you're wrong. And that led me to interest in quantitative methods. And that's what led me to MIT eventually, because I didn't have any interest in learning political theory, but I did want to sort of study every quantitative technique known to man at that point. It was Thailand that did that. And Thailand did another thing, though, about philosophically, which is that when I was in Peace Corps, I looked at everything through the Bangkok lens. How can we go out to these villages, these poor villages, and help these poor, unfortunate people to better their lives and bring them the technology and the wisdom that we have to offer them? And the programs I was associated with, namely the Village Health and Sanitation Program, really wasn't accomplishing very much. And then when I went out to the villages and was just doing kind of participant research, observational research, it was just brought home to me how incredibly different the villagers' priorities were. Looked at from the village perspective, what the villagers wanted was for the government to catch water buffalo thieves and to not bother them when they made a little moonshine for private consumption. Those were their priorities. And when you tried to get them to talk about the development projects that had been done in those villages, most of the time they couldn't even remember that there had been any because they really hadn't worked. So forever after, whenever I was engaged in a federal program to do X, Y, and Z back in the States during the 70s when I was evaluating social programs, my inclination was to say, let's take a look at this from the local level of the people that are receiving all of this beneficent help.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you say that about anthropologists. So I'm gonna tell a story. When I was in undergrad, I took a class on phylogenetics, and apparently, there's different methods of phylogenetic analysis. At least there were in the 20th century. There's not so many today in terms of like everyone uses the same core methods. There's just differences in minor detail now, because we have these tools that we can use. But it used to be evolutionary phylogenetic methods, like someone like Ernst Mayr would do, or Haeckel. It was basically like this intuitive analysis where they would look at the resemblances and create these trees. And what a phylogeneticist told me was back in the day, two researchers would disagree, and the way they would resolve their disagreement was just kind of yelling at each other that I said so, because they really didn't have anything beyond their intuition. And so that's why something like cladistics, which to be frank is kind of outmoded now because we have these computational tools, where you count the number of derived shared traits and these lineages, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need to go into the details, but all of a sudden, you actually had a common metric, like a literal metric, right? Like there's a quantitative element where you count the number of traits and stuff like that. And it wasn't just a shouting match between experts anymore. And so I think that's what social science in a way is aiming to be, right? Like you take sociological phenomenon and you attempt to figure out a framework or a method where you can actually have disagreements that are productive, and maybe there's a synthesis between the two that moves it forward. I mean, economics has a particular language of mathematics, formal mathematics. It might be a little overdone, but that's one reason that they have it. So I think it's one in terms of looking at your oeuvre. I read most of your books, and that's one thing that sets you apart, I think, from a lot of, maybe I'll say more popular social science, because in the journals that's a whole different world. But like something like What's the Matter with Kansas? I mean, it's a great book. It's interesting. But there's a lot of impressionistic aspect in there, and humans are storytelling animals, like that's really great. But I think the rigor is what kind of takes us to the next level. And so that's one reason earlier I said I was a little disappointed in how little recourse people made to things like the General Social Survey. So some listeners, I mean most listeners probably at this point will know about my blog. And in the 2000s, the second half of the 2000s, I did a lot of blog posts related to the General Social Survey. And one of the reasons was evangelism. I wanted people to see how to do it, and they could do it, and I was just hoping more people would take it up. 2020, it hasn't worked out that way. Like, again, instead of actually looking at what the data say, which is now freely available on the internet, which is a miraculous tool, people still rely on their horse sense and their intuitions, and that's where we are. Human nature is strong. You've been talking about Thailand. I was wondering, like, what was your attitude towards ideas like human nature? And I mean, even if you did use the word heritability, because you grew up in a small town in Iowa. There are people who grew up on farms, and they have told me, well, I understood heritability intuitively, and it made total sense when I heard about it when I took agricultural genetics. But like a lot of people in the cities are not like that.
In some ways, I was a real environmentalist well into the 1980s. In fact, my dissertation is about rural development in Thailand, and I talk a lot about you've got to get the incentive structures right in social policy, and if you got the incentive structures right, you can do things, but if you don't, it'll never work. And so I thought that there were all sorts of things that could be done with regard to Thailand. For example, if you wanted to get farmers to raise more pigs, you broadcast the price of pork on the local radio stations. And if there's good price for pork, they'll raise more pigs, or for hemp or whatever it is. And you don't try to do it by all of this tutoring the villagers, and this is how you ought to do a double cropping thing and so forth. And I carried that back to the States, and the analysis in Losing Ground, which was my first book after I retired as a applied social scientist for a nonprofit. That first book was very strong in saying that the problem with social policy in the 1980s is it changed the rules of the game in destructive ways, and it changed the incentives. I still believe that to be true. And it was not that I was anti-hereditarian at that point. I was perfectly comfortable with the idea that all things were heritable. I guess I was more optimistic at that point that you could, in fact, change human behavior by design with correctly structured social programs. And as time went on, and I continue to see all the ways in which it's really tough to pull that off, I began to see, an awful lot of human behavior is very sticky, and it's very sticky for reasons that have to do with genes and with evolution. And I don't know when you could say I made the full transition. Well, I guess you can actually pinpoint at least a period of time. If you go back to Losing Ground in the last chapter, you will see me saying that if you had real school choice, where poor parents had the ability to send their kids to schools that were operated the way that they thought to be operated, that you would see a major closure in test scores of blacks and whites within a matter of years. And by 1990, I didn't believe that anymore. Not just specifically about blacks versus whites. I was just much more, you can say pessimistic, I guess I'm saying realistic, in saying, changing human behavior is a very dicey thing to pull off.
Well, I mean, that's fair enough. But you spent a fair amount of your life. I mean, now it's a smaller portion, obviously, but your young life in Thailand, and also in Iowa, and I'm sure you saw cross-cultural differences. So, would you reject the thesis that? I don't know if it's an accept or reject proposition, but that the cultural context in which you develop, no matter your genetic predispositions, that the heritable aspect, matter a great deal.
I think that probably I have a kind of balanced view at this point. Of course, I would say that, wouldn't I? But for example, I know lots of East Asians. I know more East Asians than South Asians who, born and bred in the United States. and who are incredibly American in all sorts of ways. Just like my experience with you, Razib, is that you're incredibly American in all sorts of ways. But having lived in East Asia as long as I did and been married to a Thai Chinese woman for 13 years, it's also quite clear to me that there are residual characteristics that are genetic that make Scots-Irish, people with Scots-Irish ancestors like me, different from people like you with, in your case, South Asian ancestors. And what I can't figure out is why people are unhappy about that. It seems to me so obvious a case of vive la différence, you know? It's not superior or inferior, it's not better or worse, it's just different. So, you know, it's not just that when you raise kids from birth from East Asia, they still have elevated visual spatial IQ, no matter who's raised them, which is an indication of something like IQ being heritable. There are a whole bunch of other characteristics, personality traits, and so forth, which have different frequency distributions from people from different ancestral populations. And that's just fine. I'm happy with that.
Well, so when you went to Thailand, did you observe this just as an empirical fact, no matter whatever the cause was?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as I said, I was married to a woman who had you know, both of her parents were half Thai, half Chinese. However, my own opinion is that anybody who's half Chinese is basically all Chinese. I think there's at least in the case of my wife's family, the Chinese genes were really powerful, and so getting to know them and to be comfortable with that. Okay, here you want to hear a big lesson that for me, something I really absorbed very quickly, was that cultural relativism. Well, let me start that sentence again. That there are certain things that you can't change, and you shouldn't worry about the fact that you can't change them. There were some characteristics of Thais, and I'm having a hard time thinking of a specific example right now, which I really didn't like that much. But it quickly became apparent to me that to try to bridge that by pretending those differences didn't exist was silly. They do exist. And what you do is you live with them. You learn to live with them, and hopefully you not only learn to see things from the Thai perspective, but you enter into it and you empathize with it, but you don't still necessarily agree with it. It went in the 1960s when I was there, but it still goes on a lot. There is this, I think, insistence on the part of people who insist they're non-racists to say that it's all cultural, and so we can reach across these artificial differences and we're all the same. No, we aren't all the same, but it's all right. We can live with that. That has become a very tough sell in the population at large, to say, guess what, folks? Different groups of people, including people from different ancestral populations, have different profiles of personality traits, of cognitive traits, of physical traits, you name it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of differences, like let's talk about human accomplishment. A book you wrote almost 20 years ago now.
Yep.
And so, you know, actually, like, why don't I just let you let's talk about like the general result of the book, the top line result that you were talking about on, you know, the NPR shows that I listened to back then, and you know, now in 2020, what your thoughts are on the hypothesis, the data, the result, and where we're going from here.
Well, for people who aren't familiar with the book, it's a very strange book. I wanted, it was the case I wrote a book because I couldn't find any other book that had been done it, and I wanted to read the book. And so if I wanted to read the book, I had to write it. I wanted to see the whole panorama of great human accomplishment in the arts and sciences, kind of one grand sweep. And so I got used a lot of historiometric methods that are quite well developed and quite reliable and very valuable, both to characterize the most important individual human beings in the arts and sciences, and also the most important events. And in terms of my ultimate goals, I was hoping to have some kind of synthesis where you could explain Florence, or you could, in the Renaissance, or you could explain Athens in the 3rd and 4th centuries BCE. And as I got into it, I talk about getting lost in the data and having just these piles of data to play with. It was so much fun to compile lists of the top 50 composers and the top 50 Indian philosophers and the rest of it, that I spent a lot of time on that, which I thought was useful. I also spent a lot of time looking at the geographic distribution of great accomplishment within Europe in particular. But in terms of the final set of arguments, I can just briefly encapsulate what they were about why Florence, why Rome, why these sudden, very rich upwellings of great human accomplishment. And there were a few things I'll just put kind of telegraphically. One of them is that individualistic cultures really help in that. In East Asia, particularly, there is a great deal of subordination in traditional Chinese and Japanese culture of the individual to the best interests of the family. And that's both in terms of filial respect and piety, but also it's just in terms of investments of time. And the idea of saying, I'm going to go off on my own and pursue my dream, regardless of what you think, just simply was not part of the repertoire that a young Chinese person in the 14th century with an IQ of 145 was going to do. Whereas in Europe at that time, you already had a lot of kids who had that kind of talent who were going off and saying, I'm going to pursue my dream. Well, individualism helps in that. I also became increasingly persuaded. At the time, I was a real agnostic. Now I'm pretty wishy-washy. I'm an agnostic who's increasingly shaky in his faith. But I became convinced that the role of Christianity in the history of Western civilization was incredibly important. And a part of the role of Christianity in particular is the kind of autonomy that well, two things. There was a major shift in Christianity with Aquinas. So this is pre-Reformation. This is still the Catholic faith. But the Catholic faith, the theology changed dramatically with Aquinas, where it went from being, well, this life is just a shadow of what's to come, and this life must be devoted to getting to heaven, to a theology which says God is pleased to have his magnificent works understood. So science is okay. It's okay to try to understand the mysteries of the wonderful universe that God created. And that was a big deal in sponsoring the Renaissance. And the Reformation, of course, the autonomy of Protestantism also was a big deal. The other thing you need for great, and I'll just say, I think if you don't have a sense of autonomy and also a sense of transcendence, that in some way the universe makes sense, the opposite of nihilism, unless you have that kind of vision, you don't get the really great music, you don't get the really great literature, you don't get the really great art. And that's what the Renaissance had. It had that kind of sense of transcendence, but then it also got new tools. So that you had oil paints, which transformed the capabilities of two-dimensional art. You had the development of linear perspective, which transformed the possibilities of two-dimensional art. In music, you had constantly better instruments, and you also had the development of tonal harmony. These were incredibly rich tools that lent themselves to very explosive, profound, beautiful stuff. And why do things that, why in the 21st century and in the 20th century do I think that there was so little great art, so little great music, so little great literature? I think that we are looking at a very advanced culture in the 20th and 21st centuries technologically, and one which is spiritually pretty barren. And a sense of that sense of transcendence certainly isn't there anymore. And so we have technically really, exquisite things that are done sometimes, but without a lot of depth.
Yeah,
That's a very, very quick view of a very complicated argument.
yeah, obviously. So, recently, Joe Henrich at Harvard has come out with a book on, basically Western Europeans, the weird hypothesis for the origin of basically Western modernity. There's a lot of parts, a lot of people disagree with a lot of the details. So his primary focus is actually on individualism and the fact that the Roman Catholic Church, what became the Roman Catholic Church, the Western Christian Church, after 500 AD, kind of went on a campaign against what we would call endogamy, consanguinity, cousin marriage for elite lineages, and basically destroyed a lot of the kindred type cultural institutions which were the norm in other complex societies across Eurasia and also in the Roman world. And so that's kind of his like big idea. Have you read the book? Like, what do you think about it in general?
I haven't read the book, but I really ought to, because I'm perfectly willing to entertain that kind of argument. It sounds to me like it's really, really interesting. I can't say any more than that, but I've been persuaded that changes like that have profound consequences.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, you're kind of you were a bear in human accomplishment about the 20th century as well, and I think in terms of American culture in general, I think, maybe it was because I was younger and more optimistic, and also the sheen of the late 1990s was still around when I first encountered your book. Um, I don't know if I agree with it now in 2020, perhaps because I'm older, I don't know, but perhaps because the world has changed. I do feel like I'm a bit more of a bear on American culture, just insofar as I think there's a level of decay and decadence that's just hard to imagine from the perspective of someone that kind of came into adulthood in the 1990s, late 1990s, where we had so many possibilities and optimism. Have
you read Ross Douthat's book?
I haven't read it. It's on my to read. But yeah. So I've read some of the interviews. Like, what do you think about that?
I reviewed it for Claremont Review of Books. I liked it a lot.
Okay.
And I've had one of the most interesting things in it. This is a case when I first heard him make the statement. I said, "Oh no, come on, Ross, this is not true." But that he said we are in a period of technological stagnation, and I'm saying, come on, the world is radically different technologically from 1980, unimaginably different. But then he goes on to make his case, and he does it well. And he says, yeah, we've had a lot of changes, but we have moved away from the technologically sublime to much more detailed kinds of things that are very impressive in their own way, but don't have the meaning that we ascribed to technological change in the past. Now, I'm still going to make my stand and say that if you're talking about the ways that daily life has changed, that the technological revolution in the last 40 years has been phenomenal, and the last 20 years particularly. But he encapsulated his argument with a beautiful, elegant little paragraph where he said, we used to send men to the moon. Now we craft extremely expensive movies with brilliant effects that make it seem that we're going to the moon. And He has a point. And a variety of other ways, he makes a strong argument for a kind of weariness and hollowness at the center of things. So take a look at it. You'll enjoy it.
Yeah. I mean, I've listened to his interviews. I mean, definitely, I feel like there is a sense of ennui in American culture, just exhaustion,
Mhm.
and it wasn't like that 20 years ago. I mean, before 9/11, I mean, even
Yeah.
after 9/11, yeah, that was like bad, but that was the time of Team America, America number one. There was still kind of like a vigor and aggression. I want to pivot since you do have East Asian connections, just in terms of your daughters and living in Thailand. What is your perception of where China is in 2020 compared to what you had, say, thought in 1990? I wasn't giving it much thought in 1990. I did start thinking it in 2000, but I think like a 30-year view would be more informative. Like, what has surprised you? What has not surprised you? Like, how are you feeling right now in terms of China as, a big part of the human race now?
Well, I will go ahead and answer, but my answer is worth about as much as my opinion on global warming, which is it's an uninformed amateur nattering away. But I'll just make a couple of observations. Point number one is that you cannot go to China, and I haven't been there for very long, but you can't go there without just having a sense of incredible energy. At least when I went in the first decade of the 21st century, that's when I was there. Mostly it was just first, huge human capital. It's just so obvious. Second, this energy, and I thought, they're going to take over the world, but take it over in an economic sense and the rest of it, which in many ways they made a lot of progress toward doing it. But I also thought that this antiquated Communist Party was just going to be left in the ash heap of history, and that they would evolve into some form of democratic state. And so I have been pretty appalled by the ways in which they are becoming or have more openly an authoritarian state. As a person who really is not a Donald Trump fan in any way, shape, or form, I have to say it's because of the kinds of issues raised by Donald Trump complaining about trade practices and so forth, where I first became aware of a lot of the behavior of China I hadn't been aware of before. And of course, subsequently, it's gotten lots worse. The I'm really glad that we have large East Asian immigration to the United States. My hope has always been that our Chinese will beat their Chinese, but it's kind of scary to think of what a China gone wrong could do. And it sort of looks like China's going wrong.
Yeah.
Mind you, you've got at the same time down in India another huge emerging powerhouse with lots and lots of human capital and increasing wealth, and they're sitting right next to each other. So this is the point at which I wish I knew more about geopolitics.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one thing that I will say is, we are recording in the time of coronavirus, the pandemic, which like I probably could release this a year after recording and it would still be a relevant and salient point to the listener. It's gone on so long, and it will go on so long, I think. But the Chinese suppression, which I was skeptical of at first, and whenever I say that, whenever I report on their local crush and contain efforts, people are like, "Well, how do you believe it? How do you believe it?" I'm just like, okay, we're almost into November now. They've done this multiple times. There's videos that you can watch on the internet of people, old people, going about their business at Chinese buffets. A lot of expats live in China now. Yeah, they're a totalitarian state, or they're going towards that direction. But like, that's like, I mean, that's like incredible power to engage in that much Potemkinism. I think that their surveillance state, their ability to test and contain coronavirus is, in a way, it's positive because it shows that it can be done. But it's also horrifying because we do not show any of that state or cultural capacity. So right now, as we speak, to give a concrete example, in Kashgar, Kashi, the westernmost city in China, the tip of the Uyghur area, going into Central Asia, there was an outbreak. There was one woman who was working at a factory and her parents tested positive. So they're like, okay, we're going to test all 4.7 million people in the city in 2 days. They caught 138 asymptomatic cases. And so those people are obviously in quarantine. They've shut down flights. They've done all sorts of things. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure they're going to crush the Kashgar outbreak, just like they crushed the Qingdao outbreak and the localized Beijing one, the ones in Manchuria. So, they haven't abolished it. They haven't rendered it extinct. It's still there. Often it comes from people coming from abroad, but they obviously have a system where they can quote unquote live with it. Here in the United States, this is not the bubonic plague. I don't want people, thinking I'm exaggerating, but we're talking, 2 to 300,000 excess deaths. I mean, this is going to go on for a while. It's not even feasible to do crush and contain because our base level of penetration is so high. And so, we're this liberal democracy, still the most powerful nation in the world. And yet, there's public disorder due to social political conflicts. We have issues with coronavirus. Our political elites are fractured. Unfortunately, Peter Turchin's prophecies from 2010 seem to be way more correct than I had thought they would be at the time. I literally remember laughing at some of his initial Cassandra-like prophecies, like literally laughing. And now I'm just like, okay, unfortunately, that's,
well, just two observations. One is, you got to look at Thailand and Vietnam and elsewhere in South Asia too, where they also have done apparently a really good job.
Yeah.
I mean, I still have a daughter living in Bangkok, and they have done a hell of a job of containing it. The case of Thailand is definitely not because they're this bureaucratic powerhouse.
Yeah.
The other observation is, I think you're way too pessimistic about how long this is going to go on. I keep reading, this isn't from you, but I read about all these ways, and will we ever go back to stadiums again? Will we do this? And all the ways and things. We'll be living with this. No, we won't. There will be, in all probability, there will be a vaccine approved in December. There are factories ramped up, going to be churning out doses. If it's effective as people think it is, we are going to be back to normal by next summer. And by normal, I mean crowded stadiums, and it'll be, the whole, this year is going to be a year we talk about, in your case, to your grandchildren. Well, I talk very long, but it's going to be a year out of history that in retrospect is going to be just a huge anomaly. And the other weird thing, I will look back on it rather fondly. In many ways, this has been kind of a timeout that has had a certain kind of sweetness to it. Now, mind you, talk about privilege. I'm saying that because I live in a small town on 4 acres of land with a pond. And I have another one of my daughters and her husband and 2 grandchildren living next door to me. So I have not had a hard quarantine. But nonetheless, I think, main point is this. This is going to be a weird year. It's about over. We'll be back to normal very soon.
Okay. Well, I mean, I do want to say, like, just to be clear where I stand, and partly, like, I try not to say too much about this in public, but I do have friends who are virologists, and I can tell the listener, I think, that they've gone from uncertainty and, I mean, frankly, fear over the summer about the vaccine development to a high level of optimism. So I did get some probabilities and estimates from a friend of mine, and he said he is like 99% sure of a very effective virus by June 1st, but that's being conservative. So he does kind of agree with, he agrees with you, Chuck, that there will be something in, probably by January, the turn of the year, that's going to be starting to be distributed. So I don't know about the summer. I think that's a very plausible. I hope that's true. I do agree that, this isn't going to change our this is not going to change the way we live our life 5 years from now. I think what it did, though, and I wrote an article in City Journal in the spring, and I have a follow up, and by the time this podcast goes live, it probably will be live. I think what the coronavirus showed was the mettle of certain societies, or just the lack thereof. So, in the case of the United States, what I was arguing is it's an exogenous shock. It's this is an act of God. It's nature, right? Well, I mean, what do we do as a society? We should just like pull together and tackle it. And I think we kind of did that for maybe like a month or two. And then we got to bickering, and then massive protests broke out, and the public health people that were chiding people for going to beaches were saying it's now like mandatory basically to go to these protests. And I mean, it exposed like a lot of the skeletons of this country, and like there's some cancer going on there, in my opinion. So yeah, I do think that we will. I think by the time I release this, like maybe I'll be wrong. I think Joe Biden probably will have won. I think that we will have an era of good feelings, but I also think it's going to be totally fake, because I think we are not addressing the structural failings in our society. And I have to say, one of those failings, like, I identify as a libertarian I do wonder, Charles, like, I mean, how do you feel about libertarianism now? Because I feel like that's sort of like free market libertarianism. One, it's not as popular even in the Republican Party. I mean, yes, there are the Kochs and some, establishment people that are in favor of it, but, Trump is not a total aberration anymore with Hawley, and even Rubio has pivoted. So, I mean, this sort of kind of like small state libertarianism, classical liberalism, I just wonder what its end point is. Like, maybe we're at the end point, and like, the ennui and the inability to like focus on a vision. Because I think if we get to Mars, I think if our species gets to Mars, it's going to be either Elon Musk or the Chinese. It's not going to be the American state. That's my opinion.
Well, in terms of my attitude toward libertarianism, I'm strategically still optimistic, but tactically it's just total ruins. The rise of populism and of Trump has completely obliterated even the conversation about what libertarian principles are all about. Actually, I shifted to the term Madisonian when I wrote a book called By the People 4 or 5 years ago, because I realized, what, where I want to make my stand is not so much on Hayekian libertarianism, maybe so, but I want to make my stand on the original constitutional principles of limited government that were very imperfectly implemented, but were right. I think that the Constitution remains the most brilliant construction of a controlled government that can preside over a prosperous and happy society. But that's all irrelevant, because there ain't very many people like me anymore. We are not a significant part of the conversation. We're not going to be a significant part of the conversation for years to come. But Razib, and this is where I want to encourage you to not give up altogether on your remaining libertarian leanings, it is inconceivable to me, as national wealth continues to increase, as if you go back to the time series of GDP per capita, real GDP per capita, it's very likely to continue to do so under almost any political regime. It's unimaginable to me that the levels of wealth we'll have 100 years from now will be such that we can still say, oh, and what we need are tens of thousands of bureaucrats administering tens of thousands of regulations telling us how to live our lives. I think the technological changes that empower individuals will have continued. There'll be so much money we can afford all kinds of free riders and still make sure everybody has enough to live a decent living, and that we will tend towards simpler government and less intrusive government, maybe not out of the glorious political principles of American tradition, but in a very practical way. But that's strategic. 100 years from now, I'm going to be dead. a lot sooner than that, but you will be too, probably 100 years
Yeah,
from now,
yeah,
despite increased longevity. So that's down the road. But as I come to the twilight of my life, everything I have believed in is in smoldering ruins politically on the national scale. It's kind of depressing.
yeah. Well, so as we close out, I want to talk about one last thing that's kind of near and dear to my heart right now, because I have 3 children. They're pretty young, and we are starting to engage with the educational system. And what we have seen is horrifying, depressing. We can't really put it into words. And yeah, it's been a nightmare. Like I'll give a quick précis of my educational background. So just to give readers a sense of what I know. So I didn't go. I haven't been in school in any other country besides the United States. I started kindergarten in upstate New York. My dad was he was a graduate student at SUNY Albany, and we lived in kind of a lower income area. And he put me just in the local neighborhood school, which was about 50% black, and mostly lower income in general. And the teacher, she told my parents, I came in without much English. I was at the bottom 5% on the standardized test on the first day, and by the end of the year I was in the top 5%. And she really liked me, and she basically just let me read. Like I still remember reading a book about blue whales in kindergarten. So I was obviously like a self-starter in that way. Second grade, first grade, I had a teacher who, she noticed that because I didn't speak English at home, I just spoke it at school. I had some lacune with some of my words. And so she gave me a bunch of books, like basically home words books, books about living on a farm and all these things. And so they really paid attention to me. By third grade, my teacher, Mrs. Dyke, um, she kicked me out of the school. Um, she literally, so the story it's really straightforward. She was like, at the beginning of the year, she was like, "Oh, you're great." And then like at some point she's just like, "Okay, you're too," she basically said, "You're too smart for this school. You don't belong in the school. You belong in," so I was in public school 24. She's like, "You belong in public school 23 where they have an academically talented track." And I was like, "Oh, that's great, whatever." My dad was in grad school all the time. He was busy. My, mom had a kid at home, and she didn't speak English too well. So, they weren't coming in for the PTA meetings or anything. And so my teacher started harassing my father at work. She kept calling him. And so finally he came in, and she told him what he needed to do, go to the superintendent, transfer me in the middle of the year, all of this stuff. I remember my father saying at home that basically she was just not stopping. Like she just kept doing it for like a month. And so eventually, he went to the superintendent, made a plea, and I was in PS 23 like a week later. And the parting gift from this teacher was she just gave me a bunch of dictionaries, because I like reading the books, words in the dictionaries and looking at the maps. She just like gave them to me. She's like, "I shouldn't do this, but I'm just going to give this to you because you'll make better use of it." I'm telling this story because this was like a lower socioeconomic status school, and I got a great education in terms of like these teachers really like took to me, and they were obviously focused on me. Our experience, my daughter is very similar to me. I would say cognitively. We've actually had her tested on several batteries, and she's about 3 standard deviations out. And it's been a horrible experience. The schools that she has gone to are actually like quite high socioeconomically status children.
Where do you live, Razib?
I live in the West Coast. I don't want to say like where specifically. Basically, we send my daughter to the school that like the professors and the doctors send their kids to, and she gets no support for being gifted. There's almost like a level of like contempt and disdain when we try to push them a little, because she's being taught math that's about 3 grades below where she's at, because she did some home instruction with Singapore math. It's been a total nightmare, and it's been a total revelation. So the school that she is at is in the top 2% of standardized test scores in the state. The school I was at was probably in the bottom 25%. Now, I went to high school in Eastern Oregon, which was at a 50% school. It was like 50th percent on everything. The town was 12,000 people in a rural area, so that was like a different experience. But I feel like maybe I'm old, but things have changed a lot. If I could get teachers that were so interested in me, 3 out of 4 of my early teachers, one of the teachers, my second grade teacher, I don't think she liked me. And I don't think it was a race issue, because she liked the black kids. I think she didn't like me because she thought I was like too big for my britches or something, honestly, like in hindsight. But that was the exception. Uh, but the other teachers were just like super into me, and they gave me special attention. And so your book, I haven't read this one. I've read your other books. Frankly, I haven't been super interested in education until I had kids, which happens. Real Education 2008. Can you talk about that book and just like its general points?
Sure. I mean, first place, let me say that this is an instance when I practiced I went where the data led me. We moved out to this little town in rural Maryland when my second two younger children were still quite young, preschool and an infant. And we came to a place that had this. We knew the school system was very pedestrian. It wasn't terrible. Wasn't small town, farmers, working class, and so we knew that it was not going to be dangerous or in any other way unpleasant. We knew we weren't going to get a very good education. I also am completely familiar with the data, which says that didn't really make that much difference. That it's a combination of home environment plus genetic potential. And this is pretty much realized in the presence of a lot of different educational outcomes. Your story is just a wonderful story about when you were in Albany. That's great. I loved it, but you can't expect that to happen. I'd say that if I were raising children at this point, smart children, they're talented. Homeschooling is a hell of a lot easier than it used to be, Razib. You've got all sorts of resources online. There are all sorts of ways you organize with other parents, whereby there's a lot of the social interaction that you want from a school. And I would take a good, close look at the possibilities of homeschooling.
Yeah. Well, so I do have to say, Chuck, we've done a fair amount of that. The problem is my daughter is hypersocial. And so, that's why we keep trying. We keep trying
Well, you
to
know
give
what, though? Your daughter's going to do fine. But if you can, I really hope she can go to a school that's more like the one you went to in Oregon, which was a town of 12,000 people. I think that it's really important to grow up with a wide range of people. I would never send my child to a school I thought was dangerous. I wouldn't send them to school where kids in the classroom were bullying or threatening and so forth. But if you've got a school which is warm and nurturing, I can put up with quite mediocre education for my kids as long as they're getting exposure to lots of different kinds of kids. So but in her case, you know what? She's going to be just fine. And I suspect that's probably true with the other two as well. That when I went to Harvard from Newton Public High School, and I was one of the early classes when Harvard had lots of kids from around the country, from small towns like I came from. That had been a very recent development. And the word around Harvard at the time I got there was that essentially you guys are 6 months behind the kids who came from Exeter and Andover. But one of the other differences between me and the kids I had two roommates as a freshman from Exeter, who I liked a lot, but they got there and it's ho-hum, it's Harvard, we've been there, done that with Exeter. I was so excited I could barely contain myself. And there's a lot to be said for saying, look, college is the time that intellectually they're really going to spread their wings. And you will have gotten them to college with a good, solid foundation. Having said that, Razib, there's something else I've been saying to myself the last year or two. Before, I sent my kids to any college they could get into that they wanted to go to. I did not encourage the first two to go to Harvard. In fact, I kind of discouraged it, but they both got in and they both wanted to go, so I paid for it. My third daughter wanted to go to Middlebury, of all places, and so I paid for that. If I had a child now going into college, I'd say, look, I will pay for any good state university. And if you can get into the honors program of good state university, you aren't going to be wanting for anything. I am not going to pay for the top tier of elite schools. They have become toxic corrupt, evil places, and I'm not going to expose my kid to them.
Well, so I mean, that's totally reasonable, and that's one of the questions that I actually do have about this country. And you have a bigger perspective, like being in DC and being a bit older. I've said, like, people object to this word. I've said our elites are perverted. I feel like there's something seriously wrong
Yep.
with the way they behave and what their goals are. And I wonder about these schools that train them, because Harvard, produces our elites.
Yep.
Like with many exceptions. So you just said something that should make us very scared about the political class that's to come, or am I wrong?
Uh, Absolutely. What is going on right now at the New York Times, at other elite institutions, is absolutely A, astounding, and B, horrifying. We're seeing institutions with wonderful histories. I've never been a fan of the New York Times ideologically, but boy, at its best, the New York Times was incredible. And now it's becoming a propaganda sheet. And you could just run through the elite institutions in this country, and one after another, that's the case. You have the ACLU, formerly sort of a beacon of principled defense of free speech, that has become a hack organization. I'm not going to go on through the list. We have a sick upper class that runs the country in terms of what they are foisting on the rest of the country. And yet, and here's the paradox, the personal lives of a lot of these people, they're devoted parents. If anything, they're overly obsessive parents. They get married and stay married. They, in lots of ways, they're behaving in their personal lives in admirable ways. And what they're advocating for the polity is just disastrous.
But I mean, are you still optimistic that, because I mean, cultural fads come and go. For the past couple of years, many people that I know have been hoping, wishing, seeing, perceiving that the awakening, the rise of this sort of cultural radicalism, was breaking. And during the first couple of months of coronavirus, it seemed like we were not focusing on cultural politics too much. And then the last week of May, June happened, and the purges were coming, and the window of acceptable opinion had narrowed incredibly rapidly, incredibly fast. So obviously that didn't break. This stuff is not sustainable in the long run, but how long can that run be? And do we have enough in the tank to keep this country going, I guess is what I'm asking.
I think the number of disaster scenarios is large, and the plausibility of some of them is very high. I'll give you a quick one. This seems to me, it's not even a 50% probability, but it's way bigger than zero. It goes like this. The Democrats win big next Tuesday. They get both houses of Congress, and they install a lot of the woke in the bowels of the bureaucracies, the regulatory agencies, and elsewhere. And they, given the way the government runs these days, they have profound effects on that. The Democrats do pack the Supreme Court, and in other ways, they take their victory and they overreach. And there is, just as in the 2010 election after Obama's 2008 victory, there is a huge win for Republicans in 2022. And they're looking at a Supreme Court that's been packed. They're looking at a whole bunch of legislation they don't like. They're looking at a whole bunch of regulations they can't easily get rid of, but they hate. And they then continue to break the ordinary bounds that restrained the country in years past. And we are on a spiral of circular suicides, circular firing squad, where basically the country stops any resemblance to the constitutional democracy that we used to have. I before was, Irving Kristol was always, while he was alive, a source of great comfort to me, because whenever I was too alarmed at what was going on, Irving was the guy who would always say, now calm down. We've seen this sort of thing before. It's not going to be as bad as you think. And he was always right. And I am increasingly thinking that this time is different. And I know how historically that's a high risk position to take, but I'm increasingly taking it. I think this time is different. And I think the chances of catastrophe are quite substantial.
All right. Well,
Cheer you up?
I want to end on a hopeful note. Like, what are you optimistic about?
The first thing I'm optimistic about is what I said earlier, strategically, that that in a world of increasing technological empowerment, of ability to live their lives as they see fit, and financial empowerment for them to live their lives as they see fit, ultimately that will become a governing principle. And that's good. We won't be classical liberal kind of freedom, but it'll be de facto freedom. I'm optimistic about that. I am optimistic that a lot of the sterility, the spiritual sterility of the 20th century is actually reversing. I think that we may not have a religious great awakening, but I think that is a generation rising, a couple of generations rising, who are very hungry for a more thoughtful, deep exploration of spiritual issues than they were before. And they are not satisfied with sort of simple Dawkins-style atheism. And I think that's a good thing. I guess that's enough to be optimistic about, because otherwise we are probably living in a historic time that I'm afraid will see the end of the American experiment.
Yeah, well, I think we are. I share a lot of your, I don't know, not pessimism, whatever. Your just description of what's going on and the prediction of what could happen. And I would have thought I was crazy saying that 5 years ago.
Yep.
So
Yep.
cultural change is nonlinear. So speaking of nonlinearity, I should let you go, Chuck. It was great talking to you and just getting your perspective on everything. And I hope you enjoyed it too.
I enjoyed it thoroughly. Hope to do it again sometime.
All right.
This podcast for kids